Well, it is 3:30 p.m. on Friday, and I'd like to welcome everybody here to a Geo Department seminar. So on behalf of the Department of Geology, Geography, and Environmental Studies, we are very happy to see you here. And my name is Deanna Van Dyke, and I'll be hosting this seminar. I'll ask at this point for people to mute themselves if you're not going to be speaking. And it's up to you whether you want to leave your video on or your video off while people are speaking. I'll ask our presenters to keep their videos on for the next few minutes while I do some overall introductions. And then we will have three presentations today. And the presentations are preview presentations. Each of these three students will be going to a conference next week, Friday. That conference is the Michigan Academy of Sciences, Arts, and Letters conference. It will be virtual this year. And so you're going to get a chance to hear and to see their conference presentations in advance. Now, this may be a slightly longer seminar than we typically do because we're going to go with the conference timing. So each presenter at the conference will have a full 20 minutes. Most of them are aiming their presentations to be in about the 15-minute range. And then we're going to offer up today as well the remaining 5 minutes for people to ask questions. And I'd really encourage audience members to ask questions for these presentations because that will help these presenters have some sense of what the audience might be asking next week as well. If there were things that you didn't quite understand, make sure you ask a question about that. If there were things you found particularly interesting, make sure that you ask a question about that. The order of presentations will be, first of all, Jillian Herlinger, then Peter Duimstra, and then Grace Prom. And I'll introduce each of the presenters one at a time as we get to them. So I'll start by introducing Jill. And Jillian's from Saukville, Wisconsin. She majors in geology and has a minor in geography. And her presentation will be based on summer research that she did this past summer with Professor Higley. And she has continued that project also with some follow-up research in the fall semester. I was about to read the title, but Jill, I think I'm going to allow you to introduce this presentation in the best way that you would like. And as you're getting started with that, Jill, just assume that there's wild applause behind every name that you see on your screen right now.
All right. Okay, great. I'm going to work on getting my screen shared here. Okay. And get that presenting. All right, does it look good?
It looks good, thank you.
All right, so hello and welcome to my presentation. The title of my project, as you can see, is Using Ground Penetrating Radar to Investigate the Geomorphic History of Tunnel Park, Southwestern Michigan. So as Professor Van Dyke was saying, this project combines some work that happened over the summer as well as some work that I did this fall. So as we know, since their inception, the Great Lakes have been and still are cyclical and fluctuating bodies. And it's because of these fluctuations that we can see incredible geomorphic change take place in relatively short amounts of time along the lakes. Many people that have lived along the lakes for any period of time are probably acutely aware of this fact, especially with lake levels in recent years causing swift and sometimes devastating erosion. With this in mind, we wanted to study an area that has seen and is continuing to see significant changes. So this study centers around Tunnel Park, a township park outside of Holland in Ottawa County. In the bottom left, you can see the Dune Ridge. The dune itself is pretty stabilized from heavy management for park reasons. But what you can't see well in this image is the scarp along the beach, which every time we go, it seems to get taller. So the objectives for this project were first to collect ground penetrating radar data at Tunnel Park. And following that, we would reference that data to know where to collect samples from the strata at a point of interest. With those two data sets, we'd combine a knowledge of stratigraphy and sediments in order to draw conclusions about the history of the landform. Okay, I'm going to break typical research presentation format just a little as my project is particularly methods heavy. So we're going to go objective by objective, look at the methods that we used to address each one and the data that we collected as a part of it. So in order to address the first objective, our method was ground penetrating radar. We used a pulse echo ground penetrating radar unit with a 100 megahertz antenna. Our main mode of data collection for this data set is what we call the pod racer configuration, which is essentially two pulse sleds side by side, pulled at a steady rate while the GPR unit collects data points at set intervals. For this project, it was usually about 1 point per second. So here's one line of data with the raw data on top and the interpreted data on the bottom. Let's get oriented. What you're looking at is essentially a cross-section of the dune across its ridge. The left side of the screen is the north, and the right side of the screen is the south. In the bottom, interpreted version, the teal line represents the current topography, so the current land surface, and the green line represents what we interpret to be a continuous subsurface reflector. The red vertical lines are our points of interest, which we would later investigate. Here's a second line that ran perpendicular to the line that we just saw. So the left is the east and the right is the west. We see the same surface here, though in the interpreted drawing, the green line seems to meet the surface at one point, but in real life, there is no distinguishable difference there. So we just kind of interpreted that the unit fizzled out at that point. All right, so to know exactly what we're seeing when we look at GPR data, we need to understand what causes reflectors in GPR. Reflectors in GPR can be caused by a few things, like a shift in sediment mineralogy, grain size, or moisture content, just to name a few. Usually, at least in dune settings, these stratigraphic reflectors follow the general shape of the dune, indicating steady deposition. This reflector, on the other hand, has a look that's entirely different from the modern topography, which led us to ask if it's possible that this could be a paleo land surface, kind of like a paleosol, which is a soil that forms during a period of dune stability and is eventually buried by the reactivation of the dune. More specifically, we wanted to know if it could be the Holland paleosol. So some necessary background, the Holland paleosol is a specific well-developed layer noted by Arbogast et al. In the 2004 paper of the same name. From their radiocarbon dates, it seems to have developed from 3,000 to 300 years before present, and it was most likely a podzol. This is a figure from that study, and you can see the exposed paleosol in the dune there. All right, so we entered the next phase of the project with that possibility in mind, kind of knowing what we might want to be looking for to confirm or disprove that. So the next step in the process was to look at the sediments at a point of interest. So I plotted where those points we saw earlier, those red lines on the map, would fall. And we picked one to hand auger a borehole at. As we continued to auger the hole, we laid out the sediments in stratigraphic order on a clean tarp, making sure to measure the depth of each auger bucket. In the field, while the sediments were fresh out of the ground, we also cataloged their colors according to the Munsell Soil Color Guide. After that, we performed some tests in lab to get quantitative data about the sediments. This involved measuring moisture content and grain size. We measured moisture content by drying the sediments at a low temperature for a few days and making sure to mask them before and after. Then we measured the grain size by running the dry sediments through the grain size shaker. All right, so let's get into the fun part, figuring out what this all means. So first, just as it appeared coming out of the ground, here's a photograph of the sediments. The topsoil is in the upper left, and it increases in depth as it moves left and down, kind of like you were reading words on a page. Generally, the sequence is topsoil with some horizons in there, and then what we consider to be pretty run-of-the-mill dune sand for a while, after which we noticed the sand became visibly coarser. And under that coarse layer, we pulled up a really noticeably different unit that looked almost organic to us, so we called it a possibly organic sand. And then once we got past that layer, it returned to being generally normal sand, but with a slightly rustier brown color than before. So next here are the moisture content values by depth. The most moist layer was the third horizon of the topsoil. And after that, the regular and coarse dune sands were pretty consistently dry, only for a spike to appear around and just after that 300 centimeters deep, which is also where we pulled up that special layer of interest. And here's the grain size curve for the sediments by depth as well. The topsoil has a very small grain size as it's dirt. And after that, the grain size seemed to steadily increase as we went down the sand column until it peaks with the coarse sand that we noted just above the layer of interest. And as you can see after that, it dramatically decreases at that layer of interest, where the grain size is much closer to the topsoil than it is to any of the surrounding sand. So when we combine all the data from the sediments, we can see that our organic layer around 300 centimeters has notable anomalies in all means of measurement, which distinguishes it from the surrounding sediments. The color is browner and more organic. The grain size is much closer to silty, dirt-like grain size, and it held considerably more moisture than the sands of comparable depths. It's also important to note that we were able to pull out particularly organic looking chunks from that body that didn't exist other places in the strata. Some of these chunks look like old pieces of roots or maybe grass blades. Not pictured here, we also found very fragile white chunks that reacted with hydrochloric acid in the organic layer, which we kind of called carbonate nodules. So with all of that in mind, we feel pretty confident that the body around 300 centimeters deep is a paleosol. Because of its location in carbonate nodules, it could be the Holland paleosol. However, one of the defining characteristics of the Holland paleosol is its specific horizons, which, because of the imprecise nature of the auger bucket, we weren't really able to see any horizons, or they were destroyed in the process of bringing it up. The depth of the body is pretty in line with the GPR data, but the first reflector appears about 250 centimeters deep, not 300 centimeters deep, and there are a couple of reasons why that might be. First, it's possible that the ground penetrating radar wasn't entirely calibrated, so that it distorted the depth value for that specific reflector. Secondly, it's also possible that the GPR is actually showing us the layer of coarse sand on top of the paleosol rather than the paleosol itself. Some previous studies have suggested that GPR tends to pick up a shift from finer to coarser grain size relatively well, and so that could drown out the reflector underneath it. Regardless, I'm still confident in the GPR data and the unique surface that's reflected in it. And so lastly, the question presents itself, if this was in fact a paleosol, what dune setting would produce the shape that it seems to be? I'm looking particularly at the peaks and valleys in the bottom left piece of data there. And to me, it seems plausible that these are arms of a parabolic dune and the valleys are the blowout areas, but more east-west transects of the data could prove or disprove that. So in conclusion, the stratigraphy reveals a body that was once the surface of a landform. We can say with relative certainty that the body is a paleosol due to the anomalies that align with the body. This means the landscape catalogs a history of stabilization for long enough to develop a soil, and then a reactivation caused some shift, more than likely a transgression of Lake Michigan. I think it's amazing that we can see the same processes that are playing out today also recorded in the landform. So thank you so much to everybody who acted as a mentor for me throughout this process. And thank you much to the people of Ottawa County Parks for allowing us to dig a hole in their dune. Thanks to Kelvin, of course, and Michigan Space Grant Consortium as well. And here are the sources that guided this project. And that is all I have for you.
Well, thank you very much, Jill. And assume behind, again, all the screens that there's a lot of applause going on and hooting and hollering because of what you've just told people. We have a good time for questions now. And so you can ask your questions in one of two ways. You can type a question into the chat and I'll keep an eye on that and we'll relay those questions. Or you can just unmute yourself and if you're able to put your video on and ask the question directly of Jill.
I actually have a question to open us up. What do you think the causes of those carbonate nodules that you were mentioning? Like what would cause those to appear?
Yeah, so to my limited understanding of soil types, I seem to recall that that is a feature of podzols, that the like leaching, etc., makes like a calcium carbonate layer. So it would suggest plant activity, but I'm not entirely sure on that. But it was something that was definitely unique to the layer, and yeah, to me suggested previous plant activity.
That's really cool.
While we're waiting for other questions, Jill, I'll ask you, Would you have ideas or recommendations for future research based on your study?
Yeah, I think it could be really neat to try and get a better preserved like borehole of that layer in particular, just to see like, okay, if we're more careful and we pull it up in a more like preservable way, can we see the horizons in there? And secondly, to kind of do what I was talking about in the end about doing more east-west transects to really get a better idea of what that topography is under there, and so what like that suggests the dune environment maybe used to look like.
Do you have a sense from your reading of the literature? I'm assuming nobody has written about finding the Holland Paleosolan Tunnel Park, but do you know how close by you might have found an example of that?
Yeah, so it is actually named for a hall in Michigan. And so yeah, it has been found in very close locations. I could not give you an exact distance, unfortunately, from memory, but yeah, it has been found close and around, I think, above and below it on the shoreline, but has not been studied particularly in that area.
Okay. I'm seeing a question in the chat, and then actually I'll go to Professor Sturley first for his question, and then we'll go to the chat.
Shouldn't feel compelled to go to me first. But at any rate, I have, first of all, I have a comment. I really wanted to thank you, Jillian, for orienting us to your graphics, because frequently in presentations like these, someone doesn't tell us that, well, this is north on the left and south on the right, and what the depths are that we're talking about. And it was so nice that you oriented us to those. I have a couple questions here. One is that you use the phrase run-of-the-mill dune sand. What is quote run-of-the-mill dune sand? Is that a size category? Obviously mineralogical content, but could you be a little bit more informative?
Yeah, that was definitely based on my own prior experience of dune sand. So I would consider it to be majority quartz dune sand, right, of a like medium to fine grain size, kind of just like what I feel like I have experienced in other Michigan dune settings. So.
Well, that's kind of what I would have guessed, but I wanted to be sure. And of course, you're looking for a size category that's movable by aeolian processes, right? And so generally at Earth's surface gravity, you wouldn't find like pebbles being ordinary dune materials, right? So thanks. The other question I had was your organic horizon and those dark objects that you had there. Can you rule out the possibility that that is a fire layer? In other words, it could be an organic horizon and yet be a burned horizon, or it could be a soot horizon from an adjacent burn. Either way, those looked rather dark, almost like charcoal-y types materials. So is there a way right now you can rule out the fact that that might or might not be a burned over horizon?
Yeah, that's a great question. Short answer, not that I can think of, although I'm not sure why like a fire layer would have like carbonate nodules that we were looking at, unless that was like a feature of the suit. So that is one thing that would make me wonder about that. Otherwise, just the color in general. It was definitely browner, and I would maybe expect a fire layer to be more of a sooty gray.
Yeah, a chemical analysis could probably tell us both for sure. The carbonate, I mean, Michigan has a lot of carbonate in its groundwater, a lot, because we've got all this finely ground up limestone. So maybe that is a result of this being a soil horizon, or maybe it's that plus maybe it's a groundwater issue, a paleo groundwater surface as well. Yeah. And I'm not, what would I know? But I mean, that's a sort of generality about soils. You find that generally, all other things being equal, the more arid the climate, the more carbonate you sequester. But in Michigan, we also have the added value or the added confounding variable of having lots and lots and lots of dissolved carbonate in our groundwater. So I don't know, but so I'm not sure that the presence of carbonate precludes that layer from being a fire layer, but it could be all of these things, right? It could be a paleosol that had a burn event. So you had vegetation there and it burned. I mean, it'd be interesting to find out, but
Absolutely.
your case was really convincing. So thanks. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
So as I go to the chat, Professor Higley has contributed that in the future, Jill and Professor Higley can see if particles are charcoal under the microscope. So maybe able to add some evidence or lack of evidence to your suggestion. We also have, and this will be our final question for Jill, a question from Peter in the chat. Any idea what caused the increasing grain size at depth?
Yes, I do have an idea. And that is the idea, right, that if this dune was reactivated by a transgression of Lake Michigan, so Lake Michigan, like the level rising up, that the shore coming closer to this dune would have caused like faster and more consistent wind, meaning that the wind could carry larger grain sizes of sand and deposit it on top of that soil layer. And that was also what was suggested in the Arbogast et al. Paper about the Holland Paleosol, in why specifically that layer was buried as well, is because around 300 years before present, they suggested that there was lake level rise that caused the burial of the Holland Paleosol. And so I would assume that an event like that would also cause the larger grain size above our Paleosol.
Well, thank you very much for those answers to some very interesting questions and also for a very interesting presentation. And the audience will get to continue to think about these topics as we move on to Peter Duimstra's presentation. Peter is also from Wisconsin, from Appleton, Wisconsin. Not sure if there's a pattern that we're seeing here with these research projects. Peter's a geography major and an environmental studies minor, and he will be using similar methods, but a different location. And I'll have Peter introduce his site while the audience is applauding at all of their sites right now.
All right, let me get my screen shared with you all. Yes, but as Professor Van Dyke said, I did a similar project this summer using ground penetrating radar. I worked with Jill a little bit on her project. She worked a lot on my project. Okay, let's see if I can share this now. Okay, I think you should be able to. Oh.
It was coming up well. Now it's coming up well again.
All right. All right. So yeah, I used ground penetrating radar this summer as well to investigate a sedimentary archive at PJ Hoffmaster State Park. And just note this photograph. You can see just little bits of stratigraphy poking out in the scarp, which, as Jill pointed out, seems to get higher every time you go out there. And it's important because that's kind of what we were trying to record with some mixed results. So without further ado, let's get into the introduction to research question. So ground penetrating radar, you already have a basic idea of what it can accomplish based off of what Jill's project showed us. But it is a non-invasive method of observing the Earth's subsurface using radio waves. And longer radio waves will reach deeper, but at a coarser resolution, and higher frequencies will reach a shallower resolution, but give you a higher. They'll reach a shallower depth, but they'll give you a higher resolution. Sorry. So Lake Michigan dunes are important for ground penetrating radar because they give an optimal location to use this technology, because sand has a very low conductivity, which is great. So when you find those layers of contrast within the sand, it shows up really nicely on the lines, which once again you saw in Jill, and I'll show you some of mine shortly. So how does the Dune 2 stratigraphy change from crest through the subsurface? Was my research question. So the objectives of that study were to create a record of the stratigraphy in Dune 2, which is a parabolic dune blowout at Hoffmaster State Park. If you've been in fires pre-COVID, you have probably visited this site at least once. Or if you've volunteered to help Deanna haul research equipment to and from the dune. Our second objective was to map the spatial and depth variability of sediments in Dune 2 by collecting a GPR grid. And our third objective was to establish the extent of GPR signal penetration at this site. The study location, as I've previously mentioned, was Dune 2 at PJ Hoffmaster State Park. Here's a close-up of the dune and where the grid was that we collected. We'll get a little bit more into that. So we used 100 megahertz antennas just to get the balance of depth penetrated and resolution. This seemed to give us the ideal results that we wanted, although I would have loved to haul out the 50 megahertz and see just how deep we could go. So first, we collected the 40 by 40 meter grid using a 1 meter step size, which means that there was 1 meter of separation between each point of the ground penetrating radar pulse. And then the lines were each separated by approximately 5 meters. We measured it by hand, so like, there's some give and take there. And then in addition to the grid, we collected 4 high resolution lines with a 25 centimeter step size, meaning that there were 25 centimeters between each radar pulse. And we attempted to use boreholes at this site with some mixed results, just to validate the water table and determine sediment composition change. And then this map here is actually a 1 meter DEM that I took from the USGS website and used it to rectify the lines with elevation data. The only issue I had with that, though, is the DEMs were from 2018, I think, and a lot happened between 2018 and 2020. So here's the grid. I'm just going to let this play while I talk about it a little bit. So the lake is on this side, and we're looking. I could have sworn I put the north arrow on here. Sorry, let me orient myself again. Yeah, so north is this way, which means that. Oh, okay. The bottom here is pointed north. And you can see here the blue is low conductivity within the soil, while these red spots here and here are places of high conductivity. And this animated figure is just showing a slice by slice scan of each layer of the grid that we collected. Okay, so here's the study map again, just to give you some more context for each of the high resolution lines that I collected, which I am getting into now. So the line results for line 3. So most notably in the high resolution lines that we collected, there were 2 reflective layers that showed up consistently which I've highlighted with blue and red, and they showed up under the entirety of the study site. And while post-processing, I was able to trace these lines across each of the high resolution lines, still trying to tie it in with the hotspots that you saw in the last grid figure, but they were visible. Unfortunately, the borehole was not able to reach them though. So here you see again line 4, which ran on the north edge of our grid, and you can see that these two strong reflectors are still there. The red one disappeared for just a little bit at the crest of the foredune while we were going over it, but reappeared as we neared further back on the dune. And then once again, line 3, which ran directly through the Dune 2 blowout. The lines are once again visible with just a missing point in the second reflector. Yeah, so here you can see in this is line 5 now, and this one was actually behind the Dune blowout, following a unmanaged trail. And once again, the strong reflectors are still present. They're still very clear to interpret. And then line 6 was just across the scarp, and this line under here is possibly the water table. We're not completely sure, but I'm sorry. I my notes are mixed up, it seems. Here's line 3 again, and you can see that that faint line there is the same that is showing up at the bottom of line 6, which helped me actually get the blue and red lined up on line 3. So the GPR signal attenuated at a shallower depth than expected. We're not entirely sure at this point why that is. Hopefully, future research will be able to bore a little deeper and maybe get some more insight into the different sediments below the dune. And fine-grained soil could be blocking the signal, much as Jill discussed. Organic matter, small particles tend to disrupt the signal quite a bit. The shifting signal strength and depth slices, we don't fully understand why the GPR strength shifts in pockets. It could be something to do with the software, how the software actually rendered it, but it also could indicate changes in mineralogy, like magnetite, which is the black sand that you'll see at the beach, or once again, decaying organic material. There were no drastic changes in topography recorded in the GPR lines, and this was probably one of our strongest results. Most of the strong reflectors that I recorded were following the modern surface topography, even the deepest ones. So this would mean, well, actually, I'll get into the results in a second. However, the blowout grid data diverges from this pattern a little bit. And finally, the red line could represent an erosion surface from a lower lake level. So when the lake was at a lower lake level in its cycle. So the blowout present on the dune ridge is at least as old as the surrounding dune features because the continuous reflectors can be seen across the study area. If that weren't the case, we would have seen breaks within the lines or the reflectors, but that wasn't the case. We saw a continuous line underneath the entirety of the dune surface. We do not currently have enough evidence to say if changes in wind direction can be detected in this data set. That is future work, aka this weekend. In order to determine the cause of attenuation at the bottom and center of the dune, deeper soil borings are required, and this is also for future work that future students will probably have to take on. Thanks to everyone who made this project possible. It was awesome. I think we got some really awesome results, and there's plenty of future work for future students to take on. Any questions?
And as the applause goes on behind all of those names that you see on your screen, I'll remind people that you can ask questions by turning on your video. I'm not sure, Grace, does that mean you have a question? No, Grace is just being very friendly there. And or you can ask questions by putting a question into the chat.
Quick question regarding the suspected groundwater level that he saw in the third reflector. Was that pretty much, you know, at least what you could see? It was close to the level of the lake, or how did that correlate, and how did you make that original conclusion?
So when we did our first boreholes, we were limited by weight. It is a bit of a hike out there, so we did not have all the boreholes flights just to get to you know, wherever we wanted in the dune. But on the beach just underneath the scarp, we made a borehole that validated the position of the water table, and we believe that it lines up with that bottommost layer.
Okay.
So we just bored until we hit water, and then recorded the depth on the auger.
How far away from the shoreline were you when you bored that?
I would say 5 or 6 meters.
Okay, real close.
I mean, yeah, the lake was like it was right at the base of the scarp, and with lake levels fluctuating, it seemed like it was different every day. I hope that answers your question.
I have another question if there's no one else, but I'll yield to the floor too.
Why don't you go ahead and ask the question, Stuart, and then after that, I'll go to a question that I'm seeing in the chat.
Okay. Quite often when you're walking along the shoreline, you see that a lot of the dunes have a clay core, at least further south than where you were. Was there any kind of indication of you know, a clay layer below the dunes, or don't you think you saw anything like that in any of your investigation?
I can't really say if we did or not, because from my knowledge, it would show up very similarly to like a very fine like silt or like organic material. You'd get like you'd probably have a very strong reflective layer, and then it would the radar would attenuate and you'd lose signal quite quickly.
Yep. Okay.
So the question we have in the chat is from Nathan, who's asking, was there a specific reason you picked Dune 2? Was there something in the stratigraphy that you were expecting to see?
Well, as Nathan knows, I have a little bit of a background with Dune 2. And that actually played in with my decision to pick it quite a bit. You know, there have been several studies that have taken place on Dune 2 that give us some idea of how the dune behaves. And so with that background information, we thought it was a good pick because we knew some of the near past, and then we could look back and see if it was similar to something further in the past.
Thank you. Professor Sterling has a question, and we're going to do one more question before we go on to Grace's presentation. So Professor Sterling.
I'll try to make this quick. Not so quick. On your transect 3, if you could show us that radar GPR transect again.
Yeah, give me 1 second.
Take your time. While you're doing that, I have a suggestion about getting around the weight of your coring equipment.
Yeah, what you got?
Okay. My suggestion is a helicopter. That'll do the trick. Okay. If you look in a vertical line directly below the crest of your dune there, and I think this shows up on your transect 3, your line 4 as well, but you notice the reflectors kind of go crazy. If they bunch up, there's a denser concentration. They're more chaotic. Do you know already why that is, or is there room for speculation here?
Which spot are you talking about?
Directly below the crest of the present dune, just working down, and there's a width there, approximately the same width as the present crest, and all the way down to the bottom of your transect, you can see the reflectors get more dense and more chaotic. Exactly where you just threw.
Yeah.
Yes.
I believe that that's actually it's called ringing, and I think that's probably what we're seeing down here. Although this looks like it could be actual stratigraphy right here.
Yeah.
I'll get back to you on that.
I think it's interesting.
Yeah.
I'll throw one idea out at you, which could be a stupid idea, okay? But if that's a long-term crest like it looks like it is with your reflectors, what happens at the transition from the lee surface to the slip surface in terms of your microstratigraphy? If you have laminations that are dipping at vastly diverse angles, all of a sudden, what does that do to your GPR reflectors? I have no idea. I'm too ignorant. Maybe this is an artifact of the technique, but it'd be an interesting speculation at any rate.
I have another packet about what that might be.
Sorry, Melinda, it's hard to hear you.
Can you hear me now?
You're a bit garbled.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Sometimes this thing expects me to be in my headpiece and I have no idea. So I think all those hypotheses are actually possible. I think one other idea to throw into the mix there is that we might have changed our angle slightly while walking that part of the transect, because it was so
quite steep.
It was so steep, exactly. So if you change your angle at a certain point, it can cause sort of a shift in how the lines come together at that spot. So it almost looks like a false stratigraphy in a way. It also could be real. I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility, but that's where taking really good notes about what you do while you're collecting the data come into play. This was one of the first lines we collected all summer long. So we weren't taking detailed enough notes to go back to our notes and say, oh, at 30 meters, we dodged and came back. And that would directly answer that question if we could remember really well if we did that or not. So it was kind of a good lesson in, good field note taking.
Yeah. We should have recorded every time we started slipping down the dune.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we had a really rough go of it.
Well, from here, we're going to thank Peter for answering the questions. Thank everybody for their questions. Thank you also for your presentation. And we're going to change directions a bit with our next presentation. So wild applause is happening right now for what Peter has done. And we're moving over to a presentation by Grace Prom. Now, Grace is not from Wisconsin. She's from Champaign, Illinois. So that's a change right there. She is majoring in environmental studies with a political science focus. She is a double major also with Spanish and has a minor in geography. And Grace will not be taking us to the Lake Michigan shoreline, but she'll be taking us to Perseverance Dune on campus. She'll be talking about much more recent activity in her presentation, and I'll have Grace describe what she's going to be talking about.
Yeah, here, I'm going to pull it up real fast. Okay.
That looks good.
Okay, perfect. My name is Grace Prom, and I'll be presenting on the study that my team and I conducted, evaluating new plantings' effectiveness for management on dunes where human disturbance continues. Weather and human impacts can cause the sand dunes form to change over time by creating areas of erosion and deposition on the dune surface. In addition, over time, wind carries sand particles to the leeward side of a dune, which is the side facing away from the shore. This movement of sand causes some dunes to slowly migrate away from the shore. Additionally, sand dunes act as protection for communities and areas inland by acting as a barrier, protecting the communities from the high winds and strong waves that occur along some shorelines. The planting of vegetation is a common dune management strategy to keep areas from eroding or the dune from migrating. Vegetation increases sand deposition by acting as a barrier to the wind. When sand particles traveling through the wind come into contact with the vegetation, they deposit near the base of the plants. Additionally, vegetation can reduce erosion caused by waves, and a study by Fegan et al. Found that the planted vegetation reduces this erosion by approximately 40%. In addition to the foliage of plants preventing erosion, the roots of vegetation also prevent erosion because the root systems of the vegetation can bind the sand together so that the sand is not able to be as easily blown away by the wind or eroded by waves. Though vegetation and dune management strategy has been broadly studied, the effects of plantings, particularly in the first few weeks to the first couple months after planting, has not been widely studied. So for this study, we chose to use a common dune plant along the coast of Lake Michigan, Calamovilfa longifolia. Calamovilfa is commonly known as sandreed grass and is native to the North American grassland and dune environments. As of 2011, it had been sited in 22 of the 28 coastal counties in the lower peninsula of Michigan. The plant is ideal for dune management because it's a perennial with roots up to 3 meters in length. This allows the plant to prevent erosion due to the root system and to encourage deposition through the presence of its foliage. This study will only focus on Calamovilfa's effects on the dune due to its foliage. We had two main research questions we were trying to answer with this study. Our first question was, is recently planted vegetation effective as a dune management strategy? The second question was, is planted vegetation influenced by factors such as density and the presence of human impacts on the vegetation? Our first objective was to investigate levels of erosion and deposition around recently planted vegetation. Our second objective was to investigate the effects trampling and density of plants has on the surrounding dune surface. And our third objective was to compare the results from different research plots and interpret the patterns. The study took place on Perseverance Dune, which is an artificial dune on Calvin University's campus in Grand Rapids, Michigan. The dune is located on a northwest-facing slope overlooking a small pond. The plants used in this study were grown from seed and 7 months old when transplanted onto the dune. 4 plots of Calamovilfa longifolia were planted near the top of Perseverance Dune. Plots A and B were set up identically with plants in a 5x7 formation with 30 centimeters separating each plant. The rows in plots A and B were staggered to better replicate the setup that dune managers would likely use, as staggered plants have been seen to increase deposition. The Calamovilfa in plot B was trampled to study the effects of vegetation as a dune management strategy after the vegetation has been impacted by human disturbances. Plot C was a control plot, the same size as plots A and B, with no plants placed in this plot. And plot D was a dense plot, where the plants were placed in 3 rows as closely together as possible. The Calamovilfa, trampled, and control plots A, B, and C respectively, were planted and set up on October 20th, and the dense plot D, was planted on October 22nd. Plot B was trampled 3 times per week throughout a 2-week period to subject the plants to consistent and moderate trampling, without the trampling being so intense that the plants did not survive. Each plant was trampled 8 times per day that the trampling occurred, and the trampling took place 3 times per week between October 22nd and November 5th, with the plants being trampled a total of 6 days. 2 methods were used to record the erosion and deposition amounts in the plots. Erosion pins were placed in the center and 4 corners of plots A, B, and C, as seen in the map. Because plot D was densely planted, it was not possible to place an erosion pin in the center of this plot without damaging the vegetation, so pins were only placed in the 4 corners of plot D. Erosion pin heights were measured twice weekly between October 22nd and November 17th. Between November 18th and December 29th, erosion height measurements were taken only once weekly. Changes in the pin height indicated deposition or erosion, with a shorter length indicating deposition since more sand has been deposited around the base of the pin, and a longer height indicating erosion since the sand has eroded away from the base, exposing more of the pin. Leatherman-style sand traps were also placed to the south end of each plot and angled at 320 degrees. The moisture content of each plot was recorded during a span of 4 weeks. Measurements were taken twice weekly and after storm events. The moisture content samples were taken at the north and south end of each plot, as seen in the map in the bottom right of the screen. Additionally, the ground temperature of each plot was measured twice a week for a span of 4 weeks, from October 22nd to November 17th. The ground temperature measurement was taken at the center of each plot. Visual imagery and written descriptions of the plot were taken to record general characteristics as well as changes in each plot over time. And wind speed and direction were recorded using a wind vane and an anemometer that were located on the dune to the northeast of the plots. The graph below shows the average daily wind speed in meters per second from October 20th to December 29th, which is the last day that the data was recorded. The yellow bars indicate the maximum wind speed each day, and the labels above each bar show the predominant wind direction each day. The yellow highlighted section indicates the period during which the trampling of plot B occurred. As seen on the graph, there were 5 separate periods of high winds averaging above 3.5 meters per second. And those are seen here, 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 and then here. Additionally, the wind predominantly came from the southwest, with the least variation in wind direction occurring in November. October and December had more days with winds from the north and east. No consistent or significant differences were found between each plot's ground temperature after analysis, indicating that the presence of vegetation does not affect the ground temperature of a dune. The graph below shows the total surface change recorded using erosion pins between October 22nd and December 29th. The erosion pins were averaged together to measure the mean amount of erosion or deposition of each plot in the graph below. As seen in the graph below, plot D was found to have the greatest deposition, with over 3 times the deposition of the second greatest plot, plot B. In addition, plot B had an overall larger amount of deposition than plot A, both of which averaged to have more deposition than erosion. Only plot C, the control plot, had erosion occurring on the surface of it. The results that are shown in this graph were reflected throughout the weekly erosion pin measurements through the study period. Even after 1 week of collecting data, the patterns evident in the graph on the screen were beginning to emerge. Unfortunately, because the wind direction during the study period was predominantly from the south, and the sand traps were facing the north, the sand traps were not reflective of the true amount of sand moving, since they were not facing the predominant direction of the wind. And because of this, we chose not to include the sand traps in our analysis of the surface changes. Sand deposits were seen in all plots with planted vegetation. As early as 2 weeks after planting, there was an evident visual difference between the amount of sand deposited around the dense plot, plot D, as opposed to the non-dense plot, plot A. The images shown were taken around the same time and show the difference in total sand deposition that was visible. The sand deposition of the non-trampled plot was typically around the base of the plant, as well as in a straight line behind the plant away from the predominant wind direction. And that's this line here in the image. The exact location of these trailing lines behind each plant were seen to vary as the predominant wind direction changed. Additionally, there was consistently leaf litter in plot D, as the plot trapped leaves and other debris in addition to sand. Plot A only ever had a small amount of leaf litter. It was typically not trapped by the plants and appeared to only be there because the wind was dying down. While viewing each of the individual pins in plots A and B, which are the non-trampled and trampled plots respectively, plot B was seen to have a consistently higher amount of sand deposition around the plants. Both the northeast and southwest pins in plot A had a net erosion, while all of the pins in plot B had a net deposition over the 2 months that the measurements were taken. The center of both plots had a higher amount of sand deposition than any of the individual pins in each of the 4 corners. The image in the upper right-hand corner displays a trampled plant and the pattern of erosion that was typically seen around each trampled plant. The sand deposited not only around the base of each plant, but also around the leaves that were near the ground. Nearly every trampled plant had a similar pattern of sand deposition around it, and a smaller number of the non-trampled plants had visual sand deposits at all. Across all 4 plots, the south end of each plot typically had a higher moisture content than the north. The greatest and most consistent patterns of moisture content differences were between the trampled and non-trampled plots. The non-trampled Calamovilfa averages to having a greater amount of moisture than all 3 of the other plots. So we chose to focus our results on the moisture content measurements only on plots A and B, the non-trampled and trampled plots, because the results of this would best indicate whether there was a potential correlation between human impacts on vegetation and the surrounding dune environment. The moisture content of the 2 plots is consistently higher for the non-trampled plot for 5 of the 6 days that measurements were taken. The moisture content average was higher for the trampled plot than the non-trampled plot on November 16th. And examining these results more closely, only the south end of the plot had a higher moisture content. The north end of this plot had a lower moisture content than both the north and south measurements of the non-trampled plot, which is consistent with other weeks. This indicates that the higher moisture content at the south end of the plot may have been caused by an external variable or because of data error. Calamovilfa longifolia was seen to be effective in encouraging sand deposition on dunes within weeks of planting. All the plots with vegetation had a higher amount of sand deposition than the control plot. The dense plot was more effective at encouraging sand deposition as well as accumulating debris. Leaves and other debris that accumulated in plot D could lead to more sand being deposited because the debris acts as a barrier, stopping sand particles that are moving through the air. The greatest amount of sand deposition for both the trampled and non-trampled plots were seen at the center of each plot, indicating that sand accumulates in the most protected areas. A possible explanation for the greatest amounts of sand deposition being recorded at the center is that given the changing wind directions during the study period, the center of the plot was consistently protected from the wind, so sand at the center was not able to escape the plot, allowing for the deposition of sand to be greatest at the center. These results indicate that the trampled plants are effective in dune management, and that a mild amount of trampling may lead to a greater amount of deposition. This likely occurred because the trampled plants are lower to the ground and therefore more of the plant is in the section of the air where the sand particles predominantly are moving. And the image shows the trampled plot after a storm. The presence of plants, particularly the trampled, different than the areas surrounding the plants. And this can be seen in the lighter areas of sand surrounding each plant in the image, indicating that trampling of the plants was effective at changing the surrounding dune surface. This study was limited because it's performed on an artificial dune, which is not entirely reflective of the conditions of a coastal dune. But many conditions in the study do echo those that that occur when vegetation is planted as a dune management strategy. The planting time, location of the vegetation on the dune surface, and the physical arrangement of the plants is reflective of the ways that dune managers likely would arrange their plantings. And anecdotally, planting along the lakeshore in Michigan in October has been seen to be common. Additionally, staggering the plants as they were done in the study is a common technique among dune managers. In this study, the early plantings of vegetation were seen to be effective as a dune management strategy. Early vegetation plantings increased sand deposition in the area of the dune that they were planted. Trampling recently planted vegetation impacts the effectiveness of the vegetation as a dune management strategy. When the plantings were subjected to a mild amount of trampling, the plants were more effective in increasing deposition. And we will continue to do measurements of the dune further in the spring, looking at a comparison between the trampled and non-trampled plants after winter, particularly looking at the survival rates of the trampled versus non-trampled plants. These results are promising for dune managers. The results show that vegetation can be effective at a young age, and that the mild amount of trampling may increase the effectiveness of the plants. We would like to thank Deanna Van Dyke, Dave Warners, the Calvin Department of Geology, Geography, and Environmental Studies, and the Michigan Space Grant. And then here's my works cited. Yeah. Anyone have any questions?
So once again, assume wild applause behind all of these names and faces, and questions can be put into the chat, or you can unmute yourself and maybe show your video and just ask the question directly. And I am seeing a question in the chat already, Grace, and Peter is asking, did you notice any vegetation growth? If so, any differential growth between samples?
We saw not a lot of vegetation growth, but a little bit. Particularly like from when the plants were initially planted on the dune, they didn't look as healthy as they did after a couple of weeks of being on the dune, and they grew maybe a couple of inches, but I wouldn't say anything more than that. And there wasn't any obvious visual differences between the trampled plants growing versus the non-trampled plants in their health. But, yeah.
I have a question for you, Grace. I'm curious to know, how did you contrive your stomping protocol? Like, how did you come up with 2 weeks and 8 times each time you did it and all that sort of stuff? So explain that a little bit if you could.
Well, a lot of it had to do with this study was performed as a part of the fires class. So there were 4 students that were doing the measurements. So we did 8 stompings because there were 4 students and they were each doing it twice, and that was enough that the plants got a mild amount, but like not so little that was only 4 steps per day and wasn't drastically impacting it, but not so many that the plants would die after one round of people stomping on them. And the 2 weeks was the time period that we had to take measurements for.
So yeah, thank you. If you were going to consult on a dune restoration project and you wanted to retain as much sand early on as possible, might some kind of trampling strategy work its way into your management plan?
Yeah, based on the results of the study, I would say that a mild amount of trampling would be helpful in increasing the sand deposition, and that not so much that it kills the plants again, but yes, a mild amount of trampling would likely be in the.
And I wonder if there's a lower growing dune grass or a plant that might provide the same thing without getting trampled, you know, that it's staying closer to the soil surface.
That would be interesting to look into.
Anyway, while I'm on, I want to just compliment all 3 students. I thought you guys did a terrific job presenting. So I was really impressed, and this is really fun to listen to. A great way to end a week. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Dave, for saying that. And we have a question in the chat which says, would you expect any different results with different species of plants like Ammophila? And this is Nathan that's asking the question.
I wouldn't expect any different result with Ammophila, especially since Ammophila at this age is very, very similar to Calamovilfa, and it is very difficult to actually distinguish between the two of them at this age. So, like, different species that are, like, if you're using something that's not a grass, I would expect different results. But as far as young grasses at the same age, I would assume that the study results would be the same.
While I'm waiting for somebody else to come in with a question, I'll ask a question, and that's, I could see two extremes possible this spring once the snow is gone and plants start to grow. And I'm wondering if you could describe what each of those extremes might mean for the study. So one is that the trampled plants just don't show up because they died compared to the other plants. And the other one is that they show up and they look maybe as healthy as the non-trampled plot. What would those two results mean for what you would say to managers?
Yeah, so if the plants didn't show up, then I would say that the trampling of plants likely isn't a strategy that they will want to implement because, while it's effective in the short term, it won't be effective in the long term. And the likelihood of dune managers wanting sand deposition for only, say, a couple of months is unlikely if they've gone to the extent of planting the vegetation. So if the plants do emerge in the spring, then I would recommend this to dune managers as a strategy, since the plants do survive afterwards and continue to increase sand deposition in the years to come.
Thank you. Well, I want to give enough time for people who have questions to ask their questions. Maybe what I will do is this: I will formally call this seminar to a close, and I'll do that in just a minute. But after that, if we were in person, we'd often have some people milling around and maybe coming and asking a more kind of stand-up type of a question. So if you have some questions, you can continue to hang around in Zoom for the seminar. If you don't have questions and have other places that you need to go, after I draw this to a close, you should feel free to leave the seminar. But I want to officially thank all three of our seminar presenters today for their presentations, for sharing information about dunes and about dune research with us. And I want to wish you all well as you go to the conference next week, Friday. I'm sure any of the presenters would be happy to receive feedback in another venue. So if you want to give that personally in the hall, if you meet up with them, or send an email or pass that on to me and I'll pass it on to them, that would be great as well. So a big round of applause is happening now. Maybe people could show themselves applauding on video before they leave the Zoom room. Thank you very much, all of you, for your presentations. And anybody who does have a question or wants to give a comment, feel free to unmute yourself and do that at this time. I'm racking my brains trying to think of ways to draw parallels between the history type of presentations and the more immediate dune management type of presentation. But all of my questions would be highly speculative, like what if somebody had planted vegetation back when the Holland Paleosol was a soil or so. Maybe not a useful direction for speculation, but interesting to think about. One thing I would love to see happen, I'm not sure if Professor Higley and the upcoming research students would be able to do this, but I'd be very interested in seeing a ground penetrating radar trace of Perseverance Dune. We know pretty well where the soil layer is there. I imagine it would show up really nicely.
I was thinking the same thing.
And how do you think it would compare with that gentle dune slope with pulling that antenna up the slope compared to the dunes that you were working on in the summer?
Yeah, I think that'd be just a tiny bit easier than the topography that we were working on at the coast.
I'm down. Let's do it.
I think I'd like to propose Perseverance Dune as a nice practice site for the upcoming group of student researchers for the summer.
I think that's a great idea. We would just officially need permission about, where we can and cannot step.
Well, we could maybe have you run right over one of the Calamovilfa sample plots to see how ground penetrating radar affects the growth of of the plant. But other than that, we have kind of a wide open area where you could go straight up that slope or go across the slope if it would be useful for what you're doing.
Yeah. Yeah, it would be a good place to learn the methodology, because I would hope we would see nice contrast between the sand and the ground below. We won't see any cool stratigraphic layers or anything like that, but I think we would see 2 layers. So it would be cool. It'd be an improvement over some of the other stratigraphy we saw on Calvin's campus last summer.
And I think that sand, kind of grass and soil contact layer is well within your ideal range for getting signals back.
Oh, you mean depth wise?
Yep.
Oh yeah. Oh, it's, I think you've got what, like a couple decimeters of sand.
Yeah, I think in the places where it was the thickest, it might be up to 70 centimeters or even almost a meter.
Really? Still well within our range. Yeah. Yeah.
When the sand was put on the slope, it was supposed to be roughly an even 18 inches thick everywhere. But I think the people who were spreading it with the big machinery were just kind of eyeballing it. And we've definitely noticed some areas that are thicker and some that are thinner. They covered the existing topography, but kind of lost some of the interesting features of the existing topography. So they kind of smoothed things out with the
I just wanted to interject a comment like Dave Warner's and congratulate all 3 of these presenters on the clarity of their presentations, the pace. I mean, they took their time to actually explain what was going on to their audience rather than rushing through it. And these were better presentations than some I have seen by graduate students at meetings like this. So really well done. Yeah. Are there going to be other fires verbal presentations, or are they mostly opting for poster presentations then next week?
We have 3 of the research projects, and the upper level research mentors who are presenting them are in poster format.
That's what I thought.
And then we have Grace's, which is an oral presentation. In 2 cases, so both Jill and Peter are FIRE's research mentors, but they're only allowed 1 presentation at this conference. And so they're presenting on their summer research, which was a more robust data set. And in Jill's case, her research team, we have a couple of first-year students who will be presenting the poster for the team. Although Jill basically constructed most of the poster from their data. In Peter's case, he's collaborating on a poster that another team did, so we contributed data there.
Right, I'd forgotten about that restriction, but I guess there's an actual good reason for that restriction. But it does kind of trip people up a little bit sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's probably good for us as well. And maybe any of the three presenters could speak to this, but it's busy enough doing one presentation at a conference. Maybe if Jill, Peter, or Grace could think about how busy it would be trying to do two. And Jill has a little bit of that experience with preparing the poster and preparing this presentation. But
Right.
maybe it's good that the conference restricts us so that we don't take
Yeah.
on more than we can manage.
Right. And can you remind me, is one or two of Professor Sparks's summer researchers going to present at the conference upcoming, or will they present elsewhere, do you think?
Yes, so they are not going to be at this conference. I'm not sure whether they're going to the North Central Geological Society of America conference, but I know that they've put a lot of their energy into preparing the written publication and submitting that to journals,
Right.
because
Yeah.
their research was at that stage. So that was seen as a strategic way to communicate. And they may have decided to put their energy into that because that takes a great deal of energy
Yeah.
and time,
Absolutely.
and to not do conference presentations.
Well, frankly, their study would be worthy of something at the American Geophysical Union.
Right.
You know, it's that level. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
So that one's next December, right? So they might.
Yeah, it's twice a year.
on that.
Yeah. Mhm.
Okay.
They may have one in late spring or summer, but I have no idea how that's changed in COVID time. But
Mhm.
usually it was twice a year. Yeah.
Okay.
That's
Jill,
amazing.
Yeah.
It's amazing that we have such a battery of high-end presentations going on. Yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned better than some grad student presentations. I will very discreetly say better than some faculty presentations
Wow.
that I've heard in past years. So
I recall a couple of Michigan Academy meetings where there would be graduate students there that obviously just tossed something together and thought of it as a lark or something like that. And really unprofessional, totally. And these people are actually being very deliberate about organization and clarity.
mhm.
Yeah.
So I do, especially when I see grad students and undergraduate students from other institutions presenting, I do hold their supervisors partially responsible for the quality that is,
Yes.
is
Absolutely.
coming out of those presentations.
Yeah. That's right.
Whereas if it's faculty, I hold them entirely responsible for the quality of their presentation. But Jill, Peter, and Grace, you will represent Calvin very well next week,
Yep.
Friday morning.
I'll mention the same comment I made to Peter privately, is that is on his transect map, north has to be at the bottom of that map, obviously, unless the view of the map is taken from the center of the earth looking up. If you're looking down, then there can only be one orientation. He had a lake arrow, lake off to the right. So no worries.
Yeah, I had my wires crossed. I actually was just getting out of a sustainable planning exam right before this seminar. So
Yeah, I don't blame you. It's just fun.
All right, well, I'll say goodbye to everybody, and I'll go ahead and end the meeting. But thank you to our last audience members who are still here, and certainly once again, thank you, Jill, Peter, Grace. Thank you, Melinda, also for supervising them in their presentations. Have a great weekend, everybody.